Hey everyone, I'm your host Adrian. We do content like this weekly, so hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to get notified. If you want more content like this, click the like button and please leave a comment. Thanks again for watching.
Thank you so much, Adrian, and thank you to Rupa for inviting me. I am super excited, and actually thank you to everyone who made time. I know it's 2 o'clock on the East Coast, obviously earlier on the West Coast, and not so sure that I know what time it is internationally, but I'm grateful for your presence. And I actually do have some of the international stuff to share with you. So today I'm going to take you on a journey, which is back to basics, how to leverage the lipid profiles for atherogenic lipid phenotyping, and actually discuss what that atherogenic lipid phenotyping actually is and how you can use it in your practice to really provide precision cardiovascular care. We have an ambitious agenda. We're going to focus in as to why the heart disease that continues to be number one cause of mortality for both men and women in developed as well as developing nations actually is a challenging opportunity in terms of figuring out who gets it and who gets it bad. So the challenge of cardiovascular risk assessment, what should actually be the new standard of the lipid profiles. We will go on a journey to identify atherogenic lipid phenotypes or ALPs. And then we'll finish with something I call the icing on the cake. And I'm not going to tell you about it because I want you to stick around and actually see what that icing is. So the challenge, why standard lipids are misunderstood. And you probably are well familiar with standard lipid panel. This is an example of one of the large national, actually international laboratory providers. And the standard lipid panel is very common. It could be obtained from a variety of laboratories in almost all settings. Actually, some of these laboratories could be obtained with a finger prick test or venipuncture. But the typical standard lipid panel has a total cholesterol, has triglycerides, and actually calculated measurements of high density, low density lipoprotein cholesterols, good and bad cholesterols, as they known in common parlance, as well as certain calculated ratios. And it's important to understand that the standard lipid profile, and specifically LDL cholesterol, have been prominently featured in professional society guidelines for management of dyslipidemia. In 2018, American College of Cardiology released a revised guideline on management of blood cholesterol, and it had delineated evidence based on class of recommendational level of evidence, with class 1 having the strongest recommendation in the guideline. And for patients with established atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, there is, of course, a recommendation for a healthy lifestyle, but also very strong class 1 recommendation. And that's why you're seeing these green boxes here to actually lower the LDL cholesterol by at least 50% for those patients who are younger than 75, are not perceived as being at very high risk, and actually to lower it as much as possible, very often driving LDL-C to less than 70 for those patients who are in the very high risk group. And if you're not familiar with the American College of Cardiology guidelines, I encourage you to review those. There is a number of graphic outputs and slide sets that are available for free, just to become familiar with how guidelines present the information and how they identify the risk groups. You can calculate the risk for your patient who is not a patient with clinical coronary artery or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease using commonly available population-based risk estimates. And you would do that if you have a patient who is not somebody with prior medical history, but someone who you're seeing in a setting of primary prevention. Now, primary prevention, just as secondary prevention, once again, relies very heavily in its recommendation on the levels of LDL cholesterol, something that is readily available from the standard lipid profiles. And it further subdivides patients based on the level of risk as well as comorbid conditions, paying close attention to risk enhancers, and even mentioning in selected individuals a utility of some more advanced biomarkers. And keep an eye on those advanced biomarkers, because a little preview here is that our new standard lipid profile should probably include at least a couple of those selected or advanced biomarkers. So let's see how we can use this information to move forward. So the standard lipids, the ones that have been the foundational piece of the guidelines, not just the guidelines by the American College of Cardiology, but also guidelines by the European Society of Cardiology. Standard lipids, unfortunately, are misunderstood. And they're misunderstood because practitioners rely on standard lipids, especially at the level of LDL cholesterol, as a very primary determinant of what should be further investigation for their patients, as well as the treatment for their patient. Yet, half of all the patients who actually present to emergency rooms with heart attacks have normal levels of LDL cholesterol. Moreover, the standard lipid panel, the one that I showed you earlier, calculates LDL cholesterol. And this calculation may be affected by triglyceride levels. Newer equations, such as Martin-Hopkins equation, for example, have been shown to be more precise and less affected by triglyceride levels. But if triglyceride levels are high or expected to be high, let's say about 200 milligrams per deciliter, a practitioner may need to order reflex measurements to make sure that the LDL estimate could be more precise. In addition, there are common genetic mutations that actually drive risk of cardiovascular disease, and they do not affect LDL-C levels. There are other biomarkers, lipid-related and non-lipid-related biomarkers that have a very strong independent significance beyond the basic or standard lipid panel. And of course, the basic lipid panel does not account for inflammation, metabolic, and metabolomic drivers of cardiovascular disease, which is what root cause medicine is all about. The majority of risk for cardiovascular events remains despite LDL-C lowering therapy. This is a summation of some of the most prominent trials in both secondary prevention, primary prevention, and those that involve high-risk patients with and without coronary artery disease. And across these trials, you could see that reduction in major adverse cardiac events, or MACE, typically defined as non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, and cardiovascular death, is on the order of 25 to 38% with LDL-C treatment, which means that the remainder, anywhere from 62 to 75%, is actually not addressed by LDL-C lowering. And even though we'll call it residual MACE, it is interesting to note that residual MACE is actually majority of the risk that a patient may be carrying. So the challenge for us is to decide what to do and how we can revise the standard lipid profile and potentially expand it to include some of the testing that currently are labeled as advanced. Advanced tests are useful because we do know that half of all patients present with sudden cardiac death as their first and only manifestation of coronary heart disease. As I alluded to before, many patients do not have classic lipid disorders, and more patients have events while being treated with statins than patients who do not. That's the preceding slide, 30-70% residual risk that still occurs in patients who are treated. These advanced markers may point to advanced disorders that are more common than elevated LDL-C, and certainly we need a way to account for familial predispositions and to guide the treatment in that. And so the lipid panel, at least the standard lipid panel, needs context. It needs context that includes inflammation and cellular function, metabolics and metabolomics, as well as genetics. And we have multiple such markers available to a variety of laboratories. You could see here on your left-hand side, the so-called vascular tunnel that is often cited with regards to Quest and Cleveland Clinic laboratories. And of course, advanced panel that is provided, including some proprietary tests by Boston Heart Diagnostics, two of the very large cardiometabolic laboratory providers. But the issue to this advanced panel is that figuring out the right test for the right patient at the right time is actually a moving target because we don't quite have a good grasp on the patient selection, although we have some recommendation from some of the guidelines. The care standards are not firmly established with the advanced analytics, and neither is their clinical value. We have individual patient and certain population studies, but we don't have the level of evidence, for example, in class 1 what you had seen in the guideline recommendations for LDLC, we don't have that same level of evidence for advanced testing. And timing of such testing, as well as its expense, needs to be defined. So let's consider Stephen. Stephen is actually a patient of mine. I recently met him. He's a 57-year-old man. And I copied word for word. I literally copied and pasted this from his intake form. This is not his real name and not his real picture. It actually fairly closely identifies what she looks like, interestingly enough. So the health issues that Stephen wants to address initially is the treatment goals and options for elevated LDL cholesterol, triglyceride, blood pressure, and investigate inflammation, LDL number, and particle size. Health issues that he wishes to pursue in the next 3 to 6 months include improvement in lipid profile and blood pressure. And his long-term health goal is to prevent cardiovascular disease and improve overall health. Now, it is interesting that he is already taking a massive amount of action to accomplish that. He is exercising. He is certainly putting himself on low sugar, low salt, low cholesterol, low fat diet, and pretty specific in what his nutritional intake is like. So, how would we approach patients such as Stephen? Could we augment what we do with our standard lipid panels, potentially go and define the new standard lipid panel that could actually help patients like Stephen with regards to the interventions that they need to have? So, the new standard lipid profile is an opportunity for us to refine our approach. And to refine our approach, we need to first and foremost go back to the basics. Now, many patients are actually surprised to learn that the cholesterol measurements in their blood are not just measurements of a certain number, that they do reflect the distribution of cholesterol inside the area particles. And as the cholesterols are packed inside the particles, on the inside, there's a hydrophobic core of triglycerides and cholesterol esters. And on the outside, we have apolipoproteins, which are actually instrumental in disposition of these cholesterol particles in their uptake by receptors, utilization by the cells, and so on. And so the atherogenic lipoprotein universe is vast. We have chylomicrons, which bring to us triglycerides, free fatty acids from our gut. And in the body, with the interventions or biochemistry that is engaged in our liver, we progressively trim these chylomicrons to actually derive at higher and higher density lipoprotein. Now, the functions of the apolipoproteins that are attached to cholesterol particles are very important both in health and disease. And we know, for example, that for all atherogenic lipids, and this is very important, there is exactly one molecule of apolipoprotein B attached to each of the atherogenic lipoprotein particles. We have ApoB48, which is an integral protein of chylomicrons, and we have ApoB100, which is integral protein of very low density lipoprotein, intermediate density lipoprotein, low density lipoprotein, that's our LDL cholesterol, as well as P-little-a. And pretty much all of the commercial assays that you have for ApoB measure both ApoB48 and ApoB100. On the HDL, or so-called good cholesterol side, we have apolipoprotein A1 and A2. Now, those do not have one-to-one relationship with the HDL particles. So there is already a little bit of complexity being introduced. And then we have apolipoproteins C and E that are found on so-called triglyceride-rich lipoproteins or lipoprotein remnants. And as you're going to see pretty soon, those actually are important determinants of patients' cardiovascular risk. Now, lipoproteins vary by size and density. As lipoproteins get smaller and smaller, their density increases. And the reason why this is important is that the triglyceride content of lipoproteins would actually makes them participate in exchanges with enzymes that progressively trim the triglyceride content and enrich the cholesterol particle with cholesterol esters. Now, it is important to know that in the body, we can group the lipoproteins into two buckets based on their cholesterol and triglyceride content. chylomicrons that come from the gut, and very low density and intermediate density like proteins tend to be triglyceride rich, while LDL, HDL, and lipoprotein little a are cholesterol ester rich. Now, and in it lies a difficulty that goes back to our inability to precisely estimate cardiovascular risk. When we run a standard lipid profile, we're actually measuring the cholesterol mass and not its distribution. So in this diagram, you could see that you could measure, for example, LDL cholesterol mass as 100 milligrams per deciliter of plasma, but the way that LDL cholesterol is packaged could be quite different. In a patient on the left, you could see that there is preponderance of larger particles. In a patient on the right, there are significantly more particles and they're smaller in size. And if you are, for example, running panels that are giving you LDL pattern distribution, you may find that sometimes your patients come back and it says LDL pattern B. So usually pattern B are these smaller, more numerous type particles, and pattern A larger, more buoyant particles. And so there is already a discrepancy between what the LDL mass measurement can tell us and how the LDL is actually being delivered or seen by the lipid exchange systems and our tissues. And a series of studies over the past 10 to 15 years have been pretty consistent in showing us that it is that distribution of atherogenic lipids measured by ApoB that is much more predictive of cardiovascular risk than non-HDL cholesterol, which is still measuring cholesterol mass in all atherogenic lipids, not necessarily their packaging, the way that ApoB does, and both are more predictive than the level of LDL cholesterol. Two of some of the larger studies, both done in primary prevention cohorts, actually are newsworthy. FCAPS, DEXCAPS was the first major statin trial that actually showed that on treatment ApoB levels significantly predicted patients' risk, while LDL-C cholesterol did not. And Amoris was another very large study that was done in some older patient age group, where adjustment was done for traditional lipid risk factors, including LDL-C, really showing that ApoB remained a significant predictor of myocardial infarction, and LDL-C cholesterol was not, especially in women, and was only modestly associated with myocardial infarction in male patients. So the assessment of ergenic lipids in the year 2023 should include not just LDL-C, but also non-HDL C cholesterol, which is amount of cholesterol in all atherogenic lipid particles, as well as either ApoB or LDL particle number. And I personally would vote for ApoB always to be included because it shows us the quantity of atherogenic lipid particles, the atherogenic lipid particle burden, which is much more significant than just the measurement of cholesterol mass. Why? Because cholesterol mass could be up or down. And while in general, ApoB correlates with LDL-C and non-HDL-C, we may have cholesterol depleted particles. However, numerous particles essentially increase a patient's risk of having many more opportunities at atherosclerosis. Also, we need to pay attention to small dense LDL-C that we'll discuss toward the end of the presentation, as well as one of the markers recently coming into spotlight, like protein little a. So in terms of how to think about it, when you decide to upgrade your standard lipid profile to include newer measurements, the first one that you would include, of course, is ApoB. And in a situation where you may have a discordance, such as in this patient, where LDL-C cholesterol is quite acceptable, it's at 85, so certainly less than 100, and we don't know a history for this patient. Let's assume that they do not have coronary artery disease, and this is a primary prevention situation. But we have an ApoB, which is at 130. Now, an ApoB at 130 places this patient in the 90th percentile based on population percentiles from Framingham Offspring study. And despite a good level of directly measured LDL-C, this patient would be at increased cardiovascular risk. Another important measurement that you may want to include in your new standard lipid profile is the ApoB-A1 ratio. Why? The ApoB-A1 ratio is a barometer of the atherogenic to atherogenic lipoproteins in your plasma. It's essentially a measurement of the balance. And so in the Interheart study, it accounted for half of the population attributable risk of myocardial infarction. And that exceeded the estimates from diabetes, smoking, and hypertension. You could see that patients who had a highly atherogenic ratio with ApoB or A1 being in the highest quintile actually had threefold or somewhat higher risk of cardiovascular event, which is pretty significant. Also, ApoB-A1 ratio does not flatten out. You could see in this publication that it continues to be highly predictive across deciles of measurements over a more typical ratio of total cholesterol to HDL-C, right? So the new lipid profile should really be reporting an ApoB to A1 as opposed to total cholesterol to HDL-C ratios. Now, the guidelines have begun to recognize the impactful role that ApoB plays. The American guidelines in 2018 considered a risk enhancing factor, and they recommend its measurement appear particularly in the situations where triglycerides are either 200 or more, because as you heard previously, those may actually interfere with LDL calculation. On the European side, the European guidelines that were released a year later after the American guidelines in 2019 do advise that direct measurement of atherogenic ApoB lipoproteins needs to be provided to both estimate risk as well as to guide treatment decisions. And it should be the preferred measurement to further refine the role or modification of lipid-lowering therapies. Now, additional organizations are also on board with the measurement of ApoB, and the level of endorsement varies depending on the timeline. So this brings us to the possibility to now use our new standard lipid profile to define what's called atherogenic lipid phenotypes or ALPs. And it's really about particles and patterns. And the reason why you care about particles and patterns is that in those lies the key to how you're going to approach these patients. Not only treat them, for example, with statin medications, but actually personalize their treatment, define root causes so that you can monitor both the impact of therapy and define which way to take it to adjust their risk much more comprehensively. So let's look at this patient. Is this a risky lipid profile? Now, you had seen it before in my earlier slide, and maybe you remember the numbers, maybe not. But if you were just to look at this profile and say, okay, let's say this is a primary prevention patient, and you could see here that on the right-hand side, previous measurements were really good, and the current measurements are a little bit less good, if you will. The total cholesterol has slightly higher, but the rest of the lipids appear to be in a nice low risk range. However, if we were to actually uncover the new standard lipid profile and include some of the key measurements, such as ApoB, for example, or small dense LDL-C, we could see that this individual is at a significantly higher risk than we could first estimate just from the standard blood. And so remember that lipid content of lipoproteins is variable. While ApoB particles tell us the overall particle burden, they don't necessarily tell us the amount of cholesterol or triglycerides in each of those particles. And as we progress from the larger size particles, chylomicrons, the ones that are formed in the gut, to the denser and denser cholesterol particles, we progressively lose triglycerides and pick up cholesterol. And the reason why this is important is that when we do our measurements, we actually can measure ApoB postprandially without asking a patient to fast. I personally, in the first lipid test that I advise patients to have, do ask for fasting specimen just to remove a possible influence of triglycerides. And you will see why I do that in a moment. But if you are not asking for fasting specimens and you're specifically looking to augment your standard lipid profile by including ApoB, which is a much more powerful marker than LDL cholesterol, you could do it in non-fasting state. And the reason for it is that there are very few chylomicrons and significantly more very low density lipoproteins. And it's only the chylomicron population that actually be influenced by food intake. And there's actually many more LDL particles. The chylomicrons get cleared from the circulation very rapidly. So do the LDL particles. Their half-life is only 3 to 4 hours. DL particles, ApoBs that are on the LDL particle actually last for 3 to 4 days. So there's very limited impact on ApoB measurement by the food intake. Now, there is a tight regulation of very low density lipoprotein and LDL ApoB particle number through the liver. Liver, of course, is capable of taking up a certain number of LDL, VLDL particles using LDL receptor. However, majority of LDL particles get cleared from the plasma through a non-receptor related mechanism. And this is very interesting because most of our therapies are actually focusing on modifications of the LDL receptor. But LDL receptor has high acidity but low saturation for the ApoB particles. Now, the ApoB particles carrying LDL cholesterol typically get delivered to peripheral tissues and utilized by the cells, even though the cells are capable of generating or forming their own cholesterol. So the entire pathway as to why we even have an LDL receptor is not entirely clear because so many particles actually get taken up by some other non-receptor driven type of mechanism. What is important to know is that the formation of small LDL particles is a dynamic process. When we have triglyceride-rich VLDL particles, they interact with both low-density and high-density lipoprotein particles in a continuous exchange that dumps triglycerides and exchanges them for cholesterol esters. And this process is mediated by cholesterol ester transfer protein, or CEP, and the result is formation of smaller LDL particles. Now, the reason why it's important to know this, or to understand this, is that this process is heavily influenced by insulin resistance. When insulin resistance occurs, it leads to increase a release of fatty acids from adipose tissues, as well as misutilization of glucose. As fatty acids and glucose pull into the liver actually begins to increase its triglyceride production. It generates very large, very low density lipoprotein particles. And of course, as you had seen in a previous slide, these particles then are continuously exchanging its triglycerides for cholesterol esters in order to reduce themselves in size and increase their density. And as the particles float around and their triglyceride content is rich, these particles are substrates for lipoprotein lipase and hepatic lipases. And so these then start to pick the particles apart and they start to release triglycerides and phospholipids from the particles. And so we end up in a situation of high triglycerides, small and cholesterol depleted LDL particles, and very small HDL particles that have been broken down by enzymatic processes that actually are cleared very rapidly by the kidneys. This is nascent HDL. And you would recognize this as a situation that we typically call a dyslipidemic triad, right? Where we have high LDL cholesterol, high ApoB. We often have small, dense LDL, and we actually have low HDL and high triglycerides. And this is the process that I just described, only in this graphic form. And I do recommend reading the paper from Jack and this by James Mudd. It's actually a very nice and comprehensive description of how this epidemic triad factors in. So if you look at that patient that I showed you earlier, who appears to be at fairly low risk based on his basic or standard cholesterol profile, once we learn what that his ApoB is high and he also has significant amounts of small dense LDL cholesterol, we could also keep in mind that even triglycerides of 136 are not entirely a normal occurrence because in the Framingham Hope Spring Heart study, triglycerides over 130 were already at the 90th percentile, as well as ApoB over 105. So this patient certainly seems to be representative of this epidemic triad. And so you could see now how the basic lipid profiles with some augmentation, so the new basic lipid profiles, A or B and small dense LDL, could actually help you to understand atherogenic lipid phenotypes. And those phenotypes inform your interventions. So in a normal situation, you would have normal concentrations of cholesterol, such as LDL cholesterol, non-HDL cholesterol, HDL, and normal amount of ApoBs. In a situation of familial hypercholesterolemia, that's our pattern B, where most patients actually have heterozygous genetic influences and sometimes polygenic genetic influences, you will have normal triglycerides but elevated ApoB. So this is primarily a genetically driven disorder. In the situation C, where there are high triglycerides but normal ApoB, this is another example of a familial genetic disorder, only this time around the genes are acting in the triglyceride pathways more so than in the LDL-C pathways. And probably the most common observation in clinical practice is the pattern D, where we have high triglyceride, high ApoB, and this is a manifestation of dyslipidemic triad and typically described as familial combined dyslipidemia. And you could actually see this in terms of investigating it with polygenic inheritances. There are certain specific genetic markers that in polygenic risk scores will forecast increased risk for familial combined dyslipidemia. Finally, pattern E is very rare. It's called remnant dysproteinemia or type 3 hypolipoproteinemia due to homozygous ApoE22, and it's not very common in clinical practice, although you might encounter this. These are patients whose triglycerides are typically over 1,000. So defining this particular patient atherogenic lipid phenotype is helpful because once you recognize that this is familial combined dyslipidemia and you recognize the hallmarks of dyslipidemic triad where the root cause is insulin resistance, you can now personalize your therapy for this individual to actually address his or her insulin sensitivity, as well as the burden of ApoB particles and the level of LDL-C cholesterol. And now we come to the icing on the cake. And hopefully, you're not eating too much icing on the cake because it's really not good for you. But I thought it would give you a little bit of additional tools in your toolkit, if you will, in figuring out what should be your new standard lipid profile to appropriately risk stratify your patient. So we're going to talk about triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, small dense LDL-C, HDL, and lipoprotein little a. And please bear in mind that each of those could be a subject of a very long discussion. And actually, I run a course that specifically addresses other markers of cardiovascular risk. And this discussion takes us several hours. So if you look at the atherosclerosis as a process, and it's a lifelong process, you do recognize that it's sort of yin and yang phenomena, right? On one end, in this red triangle of oxidation, thrombosis, and inflammation, we have multiple influences that are engaging atherogenic lipids, oxidizing these lipids and sticking them onto inflamed blood vessels. And there's a feedback loop that interacts between inflammation, immune system activation, and oxidative stress. And we know that lifestyle that is promotes obesity, insulin resistance with some hereditary factors is pushes that process. On the other hand, we know that antioxidants and inflammatory intervention and things that individuals such as my patient Stephen are already doing, diet, physical activity, is the yang that allows us to actually offset the damage that is done on the red side. Now, there are certain markers in the lipid profile that you may wish to include because they are so powerful that they go beyond ApoB predictions or LDL-C cholesterol prediction, or even particle prediction to refine your patient risk. One of them is small dense LDL. Now that you have seen the dyslipidemic triad, you know where it comes from. And in multiple studies, we have seen that elevations in small dense LDL predicts cardiovascular events independently of LDL-C. Small dense LDL is significantly associated with progression of cardiovascular disease, for example, in CABG patients. And once we're able to reduce it, there is decreased risk associated with this level of reduction. And even in patients who have LDL cholesterol under control, up to 40% of such patients remain at risk if their SD, small dense LDL cholesterol levels, are high. In some of the larger studies done recently, patients who have both LDL cholesterol and small dense LDL cholesterol elevations are in the highest risk groups. And so in those patients, you would not just aim for LDL or ApoB reduction, but you will actually aim for reduction in small dense LDLC by understanding how this lipidemic triad works and by really addressing their issues with insulin sensitivity. In one of the recent studies, authors the impact of triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, or TRLs, you can call them cholesterol-enriched remnants, as well as small dense LDLC. So they're looking at what is the downstream impact of the dyslipidemic triad. And what they did determine is that elevations in the triglyceride-rich lipoproteins were highly correlated to increased risk of myocardial infarction and peripheral arterial disease, while elevation in small dense LDL cholesterol had the highest association with increased risk of MI. And if you look, of course, these numbers are staggering. So patients who were in the highest group for small dense LDLC had almost a four-fold higher risk of myocardial infarction, and patients who had triglyceride-rich lipoproteins or cholesterol-rich remnants. And the remnants are just the sort of effect of this constant exchange between triglycerides and cholesterol esters and lipoprotein particles. These patients had a threefold higher risk of myocardial infarction and 2.6 higher risk of peripheral arterial disease. So very staggering numbers. Now, when you are measuring the lipids and you do have a standard lipid profile, you can use non-HDLC as a surrogate marker of what those triglyceride-rich lipoprotein remnants might be. So here, non-HDLC actually reflects the cholesterol content, cholesterol mass of all atherogenic ApoB particles, of which triglyceride-rich lipoprotein remnants are one of the parts, as well as small dense LDLC, while ApoB reflects the distribution, right? It reflects the total number of atherogenic lipoprotein particles. So these are impactful measures. Now, your new standard lipoprotein lipid profile may include some of the advanced tests, and I find a lot of utility in HDL-MEP test, which looks at the value of alpha-1 subunit, the one that has the highest amount of ApoA1 protein attached to it. For example, if you look at this particular patient, you may find out that while they have a fairly good carrying capacity in terms of just HDL particles in general, their ApoA1 is in the optimal group. Their alpha 1, or the largest subunit that will be doing most of the work, is actually not in the best group for this particular patient. And the reason why we care is that because the alpha 1 levels actually have a very strong inverse association with both prevalence of coronary heart disease as well as recurrence of cardiovascular events. So it's a very impactful measurement, and the association is very strong that for each milligram increase in alpha 1 HDL, there is a specific numerical progression or regression in cardiovascular events. So another very important part of what your new standard lipoprotein or lipid profile may actually include. And finally, we come to lipoprotein little a. Now, lipoprotein little a is still an enigma. It is a specific lipoprotein that typically is attached to ApoB type of particles, LDL cholesterol. It has been intensely evaluated and had been a subject of a lot of investigations and new medications. The reason for it is that it is an independent cardiovascular risk factor, highly genetically determined, and it actually doubles the risk of cardiovascular disease, especially when you see a patient who has a family history of cardiovascular disease in young relatives, premature disease, usually ages 60 or younger, or patients who have calcific aortic stenosis. We don't have right now the type of treatments that could actually help, although some of them are on the horizon. And statins, which we still will use if patients need LDL phenolipid reduction, do not lower lipoprotein(a) and may actually increase it. The reason why we care about lipoprotein(a) is that it is small but mighty because it's pro-atherogenic, pro-inflammatory, and pro-thrombotic. It is involved in oxidation of phospholipids, so it actually increases our oxidative stress and really is engaged across a wide spectrum of biochemical reaction. We also recognize that the laboratory assessments of lipoprotein(a) have been challenging because of so many different isoforms and types. It's been measured, has recently been redefined, although experts have finally reached an agreement onto the cutoff parameters for lipoprotein(a). So this is, of course, the lipid profiles and their impact in cardiovascular disease is a very complex topics. I run a course called Statin Overprescribing Solution, and we currently are in the middle of our first cohort. We have spent some time looking at risk assessments as well as lipid profiles, including advanced biomarkers that go beyond the standard profiles that look at metabolics and metabolomics, inflammation, immune system activation. And we're about to progress into monogenic and polygenic determinants of risk to round off this topic. And I'd like to offer you for your time a coupon and a small discount to join us. We have facilitated learning through online modules as well as live case discussions that happen every 2 weeks to help our practitioners to actually look at the various lipid profiles and patient scenarios and to give them the tools that they need to really execute precision cardiology pathway. And I will stop at this point so that we can answer some questions that are coming up from our audience.
Dr. Drews, thank you so much. I don't think I've had a more punctual presenter, actually, right on the nose at that 45 minutes. So thank you so much. So I appreciate you spending the time on that. We had a ton of questions coming in. And again, just to reiterate what came through the chat, if you do have any questions for Dr. Drews, go ahead and use that Q&A button in the menu bar. That is how we ask questions in these webinars. But let's just hop right in. What is the triglyceride reflex measurements?
So it's not the triglyceride reflex measurements, it's actually LDL reflex measurements. These are the measurements that labs will do when triglycerides are high. So usually if you get triglycerides greater than 200, the labs may do that. So they will manipulate the way that they measure, and they will measure LDL directly. They will not compute it because that's the known issue with the laboratories. The recent computations, though, the Martin-Hopkins equation actually uses a factor that allows LDL calculation to be more robust, even in the presence of high triglycerides. But in essence, when you see reflex LDL, it means it was directly measured.
Interesting. Besides statins, what are good options for treatment of ApoB?
So as you had seen, this lipidemic triad plays a huge role. Actually, statins are not as impactful for ApoB. They will lower LDL-C, right? So they will lower the cholesterol mass. They may not necessarily lower ApoB as much because the ApoB is more dependent on insulin resistance / insulin sensitivity and what the liver response actually is to the overall metabolic burden that the body is carrying. And as you heard, the LDL receptor actually has very high affinity for ApoB particles, but low saturation points. And most of these ApoB particles are still cleared by the liver through non-receptor mediated mechanism. So that explains why even in the trials that have actually specifically focused on preservation of LDL receptor, the one that sucks up the ApoB particles, and I'm specifically talking about PCSK9 inhibitors, we had seen very low LDL-C levels, but we don't necessarily see it translate to a massive reduction in cardiovascular events because it won't necessarily address these other factors, although it will drop your ApoB just by quite significant factors. So diet, exercise, root cause medicine, lifestyle modification, those are additional strategies.
Absolutely. How common is the LDL-C ApoB discordance? If you were to say a percentage, and then does it vary by ethnicity?
Great question. I actually don't know if it varies by ethnicity. I would say that, for example, very often some patients and patients Southeast Asian descent, very often in those patients, we encounter a situation called skin fat, where these patients look, their BMI might be normal, or maybe just slightly overweight, but they have very high visceral fat content, including content in between the organs. And you may see in that situation a discordance between LDL-C and ApoB. Now, if a patient is on a statin medication, this is another common trace where you would see low LDL-C levels, but you may still see higher than normal ApoB levels.
Great. Can you comment briefly on how these biomarkers would influence treatment? Are we just doing more tests? Are we just doing more tests, but more patients on statins? If not statins, what are you using, recommending, and are they specific to these biomarkers?
So that is exactly that question. Whoever asked it, thank you so much. Because that question is exactly what I've been asking myself in my practice. And this is how statin overprescribing solution course actually came to be about. Because I wanted to answer to myself and to my patients what else can be done and what is the value of those advanced biomarkers. And actually create a system that allows practitioners to go beyond statins. And if they are using statins, understand how to use them and how to use them to tap in into some of their unique properties that go beyond just LDL cholesterol lowering. So join us for the course and you will find out.
Absolutely. I love it. And we'll give more references to that course as we go through. And of course, we'll send a follow up email, not only with the recording, but a little code that Dr. Drew's highlighted at the end there. Do you treat significant elevations of lipoprotein A, LPA, with niacin?
I personally do not like using niacin for a number of reasons. Often leads to glucose elevation and patient tolerance isn't as great as there really isn't a specific agent, whether it's in pharmacological domain or in the non-pharmacological domain that has a good track with lipoprotein little a. I can tell you that people have used PCSK9 inhibitors, but that is hit or miss. They really not necessarily reducing lipoprotein little a. Statin medications tends to increase it, but if a person also has elevated LDL-C or ApoB, depending on their risk situation, on the context, some amount of statins may be useful. Vitamin C, because it is an antioxidant, has been suggested for lipoprotein. There is some good data to support it. Bioidentical or biocompatible hormonal replacement therapy, in my experience, has the greatest impact. But obviously, one wouldn't necessarily start it just for lipoprotein little e. Patient has to meet criteria for bioidentical hormonal replacement for a number of other reasons and actually be comfortable with the idea. I do actually an NAD precursor called NMN that I had trialed in a few patients. I had seen some lipoprotein A reductions. I have not been able to drop it by more than 50%. And I found that when I do drop it in some patients by 50%, it's not necessarily a sustainable drop. So for some patients, this very high levels, there's actually lipoprotein A apheresis. It is like hemodialysis, except for proteins. It does lead to a drop, but again, the drop is not sustainable. It results in about 1 to 2 weeks.
What is the difference between standard LDL and LDL particles?
So the remember that the most important takeaway from some of the points that I mentioned is that LDL measurement, whether it's a calculated LDL, let's say it's directly LDL measurement, right? So direct LDL-C. That simply gives us a total cholesterol mass, right? It does not give us any understanding of how it is distributed. So for a given level of LDL-C, an individual who packages it more tightly in many more particles, small size, and therefore has a higher ApoB level, will be at higher risk of cardiovascular events than an individual who packages it in bigger, more buoyant particles. So LDL-C of 100 may be the same in person A and person B, but a person with higher number of ApoB and or small dense LDL-C is at a much higher risk, even at the same LDL.
Yeah. Will vitamin K2 and K7 influence somehow advanced lipid profile? And if yes, do you know how?
Have never seen it, and I would not even venture out there to figure out what the mechanism might be. I remember that there's a lot of fascination with MK7, but the physiological impact of it is yet to be demonstrated. It's all theoretical, right? Realization of calcium exchanges and so on. The answer is no.
Yeah. And folks, I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in through the chat. Again, please use that Q&A button if you do have questions for Dr. Drews. And just a heads up, I'm going to avoid asking any questions that are very specific to like patient treatment. If you do have any types of questions, that's exactly what Dr. Drews has that program available for to help find those answers. So what about epigenetics? If a patient changes their lifestyle, diets, etc., can they change gene expression and improve these outcomes?
Yes and yes. And I think we are probably in the most phenomenal time right now for genetics because genetics actually is moving mainstream, not only direct to consumer, but it's now accessible pretty much through a lot of major laboratory providers. There is certainly monogenic risk estimates that could even tell us if a patient is likely to respond to statin medications, or are they someone who will benefit from aspirin? And that actually has to do with lipoprotein A metabolism, as well as polygenic risk scores. And polygenic risk scores are currently commercially available and could be used in the context of or supplement lipid testing. And we have both monogenic and polygenic modules specific around that statin overprescribing solution course. The patient who I showed you previously, these laboratory values that allowed us to see how basic lipid profile was just not sufficient to stratify this person, and they had high ApoB and they had small dense LDLC. This is a patient where you may want to actually get a polygenic risk score and see if they are at a highest risk of cardiovascular disease versus the reference population.
Absolutely. Once you know LPA little a after testing, do you have to retest?
It depends on what you're doing, right? Technically, it wouldn't really vary much. But if you do put out their specific course of treatment for this patient, let's say you are putting this patient on a diet that will lower inflammation, right? So anti-inflammatory, antioxidant diet, you will be addressing their insulin resistance. Maybe you will be using hormonal therapy if otherwise indicated for this particular patient. Or if you are an ISM user, perhaps you're using that. You may want to repeat your lipoprotein little a, but there's a lot of variability. So the guidelines will tell you no. They will tell you just test it once for an adult, and that's the level. If you are though putting a program in place that is you're thinking is going to affect the levels, it's probably reasonable to retest.
I love it. I know we're running out of time here. I wish we could stay forever to answer all these questions, but last few questions we've got here. So thoughts on arterial calcium score and homocysteine and their correlation to ApoB in assessing CVD risk?
So it's not that there is necessarily a one-to-one correlation, but I think it's important for people, for my colleagues to understand is that there are things that drive atherosclerosis and actually promote it. And then there are measures of the impact of those factors, right? So when we get a lipid profile, when we get advanced markers for inflammation, metabolics, metabolomics, genetics, how do we know if they're actually impacting our patient? And this is where not only coronary artery calcium score, but actually plaque imaging and inflammation imaging of the plaques becomes super important. And then now, of course, we have a whole primer on cardiovascular imaging because I'm actually cardiovascular imaging myself. I do all non-invasive imaging modalities, including cardiac CT. So it plays a huge role in trying to understand how you put the lipid profile and advanced markers in context, right? So you're literally connecting the dots.
Amazing. Dr. Drews, where can people find you if they have questions?
They can find me on LinkedIn. They can also email me. I should have put my email in there, but you have my website in there with the courses and you will find more information. So we're at holisticcardscenters.com and the email is admin@holisticcardscenter, not centers.com. So admin@holisticcardscenter.com. I'm also on Facebook. I run a little group called Concierge Practice Business Blueprint. I'm looking forward to connecting.
Dr. Drews, thank you so much for your time. I know we are at the hour Do you have any final thoughts for the folks who joined us today?
First, I want to thank them for making the time for this presentation and actually attending it live. I know that a lot of people get a recording, but I certainly want to say yes. And I do want to encourage them to work with Rupa and with their laboratory providers to actually stretch themselves, fill the gap a little bit, and go beyond that standard lipid profile because there's a lot of value. And Adrian, I think I think I will type in, there are so many messages here that I'm not even sure like which place I should be in. I'm going to try to like hit
Go
on
for
that
it.
chat box. So I'm sorry I was not able to look at the chat as I spoke because it's just not physically possible. And I think even for Adrian, he's been catching the questions. So I typed in my email into the chat box and admin at holisticcarcenter.com. I'm happy to connect.
Amazing. And I'll send a follow-up email, everybody. We'll have the recording as well as the slides and any contact information, as well as the code for the promotion that Dr. Drews has so kindly offered everyone. But Dr. Drews, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to do a quick transition into Rupa Health. You're welcome to stick around or you can hop right off. But again, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And folks, if you are interested in learning a little bit more about lab tests, how to access them, that is exactly what we do here at Rupa. And so for those of you who may have joined late or it's your first time joining, my name is Adrian Martinez. I am the head of practitioner partnerships here at Rupa Health, and it's my job not only to host these fantastic webinars, but to speak to practitioners every single day to ensure that they have access to the testing for their patients that they need. Now, before going even further, I know we did have some international folks joining us. Right now, Rupa is only available for patients in the US. If you're an international practitioner, but you have patients in the US, you can actually use Rupa. But again, Rupa right now only does ship within the United States for patients in the United States. So what is Rupa? Who are we? What do we do? Why do we do what we do? We're a functional medicine lab platform. Really at our core, what our mission is to help bring root cause medicine to every person who needs it. Right now, there are a lot of pain points when it comes to ordering these tests. And so that's exactly what we help, or at least try to help resolve for. And some of the ways that we do that is by giving you a one-stop shop to get access to over 30 different labs including basic blood labs, gut tests, hair tests, breath tests, stool tests, you name it. So instead of having to go to each individual lab to order your tests or even set up accounts, you have one account with Rupa Health and you have access to over 3,000 tests in place. Beyond that, we'll also handle the patient experience. So we can handle billing with the patients. We'll reach out to them, handle support questions that come in through the line. If something happens with a specimen, we'll handle and manage that directly with the patient in the lab. Basically, what we will do is offload all of that admin work that takes time out of your day off your shoulders onto ours. Now, how does it work? Let me move my head from the Zoom thing real quick. I'm going to show you how simple it is to start an order. To start an order on Rupa Health, all you need to have is the patient's first name, last name, and email address. Traditionally, you can order testing that your license allows you to order, but we do have a program called Physician Services. So if your license does limit your ability to order testing for patients, we can partner you with a licensed physician who would order those tests on behalf of you for your patients. So you would make that recommendations, and then our team would go ahead and put that order through for your patients. It's also great for telehealth as well. Let's say that you're a practitioner, maybe you are fully licensed in the state of California, but you want to work with patients in Colorado, Nevada, or anywhere else. That program would work perfectly for you there. And so once I have that patient's first name, last name, and email address, I can go ahead and order. I can do things like creating custom bundles. I can go down below. I can create a favorites list. So individual tests that I'm commonly ordering, I can put a heart next to it. So it's appearing directly at the top here. And then down at the very bottom, I can do searches. Again, we work with over 30 different labs and have over 3,000 different tests within our catalog. So to help make things a bit easier, you can do things like filter by lab company. You can filter by sample type. I can even search by biomarker. So if I'm searching for very specific biomarkers that Dr. Drews, for example, was speaking about during her presentation, I can search for them within this. Or I can go ahead and search, let's say, lipid panel and see what comes up. Once I search lipid panel, there we go. We have access to the number of lipid panels that we have available on our site. Let's go ahead and use Boston Heart. I know that Dr. Drews loves Boston Heart, but what's cool about this is that I can even do things like comparing tests. So let's say that I want to compare some tests on the platform. I have 3 or 4 different lipid panels on the platform. I can add that lipid panel from Boston Heart in here, but maybe I want to add a few more. So I can go ahead and make that search and add all of the lipid panels directly into my comparison tool. See that comparison? And now I have all 4 of those lipid panels directly in here. Scroll down, I can see everything from cost to sample reports if they're available, collection instructions that we'll send the patient. And then down below, I can view all the biomarkers of what's being tested within this profile. Really cool. We're the only people on the market that offer this type of tool because we're the only people in the market that have this comprehensive of a list of testing all in one place. Once you decided which one that you want, you can go ahead and add that to your order. We'll stick with the Boston Heart one for now. If that's the only kit that I want to order, I can go ahead and click send to patient, and that's it. We'll reach out to the patient. We'll handle billing with the patient. We can help coordinate phlebotomies. So, of course, some of these lipid panels do require blood draws. And so, if you are in a position where you don't know where to send your patient for their blood draws, we will go ahead and step in, send over options and resources to your patients. They can reach out to us and our team, and we will help facilitate finding any viable options within a 25-mile radius of them. Let them know any additional costs that might be associated to it, as well as offering multiple different payment solutions. So beyond credit or debit, we can offer HSA, we can offer FSA, and we can even set up a 3-month interest-free payment plan with these patients to help get them access to these tests. While this lipid profile or lipid panel may be a little inexpensive, if you're running maybe a hormone test alongside it, those numbers can add up pretty quickly. And so what we're doing is we will help lower that barrier to get access to these tests. Now, Rupa is a free account to sign up for. The way that we make our money here at Rupa is we charge a 7% processing and ordering fee on each order. Now, this is paid for by whoever pays for the tests. So what this will do is if you're allowing us to bill the patient and manage billing with the patient directly, they will pay for everything. They'll pay for the cost of the test. They'll also pay for that 7%. The alternative being you pay for the tests yourself, and then you probably want to bill the patient separately, right? Unless you, of course, want to eat that cost. Who am I to judge? But it doesn't matter who's paying for the tests. The cost of the tests are the same whether you're paying or the patient's paying. Send a patient. We take care of everything in the in-between, and then you just hop right back at your dashboard, and you're able to track all of your results straight away within our platform. You can download them, send them to your patient, and if you require some consultation, want to ask them questions, you can schedule time with a clinician from the lab that you order the tests from, and they will be able to help you out with interpretation assistance. We even have some cool tools like creating a result summary. The result summary allows you to create a patient-facing, more easily digestible form that can outline any outlying biomarkers, outline next steps, any potential supplementation that you want to add on there. You can add your logo onto it. So it's just a really cool tool to make your life a bit easier when it comes to helping the patient out to really understand what's going on within their test. We can do in-office kits as well. So if you prefer to stock your kits in office, we can work with you on that. We offer that through 6 of our labs, and that list is growing. But let me know if that's something that you're interested in. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and drop ship those kits to your patients. You're no longer going to have to stock your kits. Additionally, beyond those products that I've shown you so far, we can even create an e-commerce platform for you. And so what this is called lab shops. If you want to advertise the testing offered on your website, we can create a lab shop for you. It will go right on your site, and you can go ahead and get your patients access to these kits even quicker than before. Let me know if you have any questions on this. It's a free tool that we offer on our platform. It's really nice. And then finally, beyond just somewhere where you can come and order all your tests in one place, we also offer the ability to learn. You're all in a live class right now. We do these every single week. So you're welcome to join these for free. You can see the ones we have coming up with Dr. Yael Jaffe. We have another one coming up with Dr. Julie Greenberg on eczema. That one's going to be fantastic, but we also do paid options as well. So we do 6-week boot camps. So if you are interested in joining a boot camp, it's 6 weeks. They usually run about $400. They come with a test as well that you run on yourself. And then from there, you're able to go through the interpretation of the results along with each class through that 6 weeks. We have a full catalog of live classes and webinars that we've done in the past. We have a magazine, we have a podcast. So there's so much information available for you here on Rupa Health. So if you have any questions, I'm going to put my information up here. Feel free to reach out to me. Again, my name is Adrian. I'm the head of practitioner partnerships at Rupa Health. Feel free to reach out to me on email, phone, text me, call me, whatever's easiest for you. Would love to set up some time and go through a little bit about Rupa Health and what we do. I'll see if there's any questions for me that came through the chat. But otherwise, thank you all for joining. Let's see here. Thank you all for joining. For which laboratories can those in physician receive consultations with the labs? Yeah, so great questions. This question has to do with physician services. So the physician services, again, to reiterate, is the program that allows you to work with a certified physician to order tests for your patients. Right now, we cannot do consultations with any of the labs through physician services. We understand that is obviously a big roadblock for some physicians or for some practitioners looking to get access to that. We're working on it right now. There is no solution for it. but we are working on finding a best solution available for that program. But to answer your question, right now you cannot get consultation services when you are using physician services. If I'm ordering clinician, why does the lab not want to talk to me? After all, I'm the one ordering the doctor. There may be some confusion there, Dr. Conrad. So if you are the ordering clinician, you do have the ability to schedule a consultation. However, if you are using the physician services program where you would not be the one ordering, you would not have access to that. But if you are ordering under your license, you do have the ability to schedule a consultation with the lab if you do have questions. Perfect. Stephanie, sorry we weren't able to get to your question. We had about 40 questions in there. It's tough to get to 40 questions in about 15 minutes, understand. But if there's any questions that you do have for Dr. Drews, feel free to reach out to her directly on admin@holisticcenters.com or center.com, not centers. So, folks, I appreciate the time today. Thank you so much for joining us. Be sure to check out our next live class that we have next week with Dr. Yael Jaffe. It's going to be a fun one. They're a fantastic team. So let me know if you have any questions. And again, here's my contact information. I'll go ahead and send a follow email within the next few days with that recording. But I appreciate y'all joining today. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.